Hey guys, in today's video, I want to show you a sequence of tips on the forehand that can make your forehand a lot worse, but more importantly, it can also cause injury to your wrist. One advice that's very common is to relax the wrist. And I've made many videos on how relaxation in the game of tennis is indeed a myth, because stability at the moment of contact is extremely important. And if the wrist is too relaxed, you're gonna lack that so important stability at the moment of contact. So you do have to hold on to the racket. Now, of course, you don't want to be stiff and hold the racket too tight. So unless you are a player who suffers from stiffness, where you're cramped and you're choking the grip and you therefore get less range of motion, less power, less control, of course you have to loosen your hold. You have to also make sure that you're holding the racket correctly. You shouldn't choke up on the grip like this, where your fingers are close together. You have to have the knuckles on an angle in relation to the grip going up and down. So you don't want the knuckles aligned with the grip. You want the knuckles to be at an angle. So naturally, that's going to result in the pinky being on the edge and the end of your racket being inside of your palm. That is the correct way to hold the racket on all strokes, except the one-handed backhand, where you're going to have a little bit of a tighter hold. Now, when it comes to the forehand, it is very important that you have stability at the moment of contact. So if you hit the ball and the racket is moving, or maybe even the grip is switching on you as you're making contact, you're holding it too loose. So you want to provide enough stability so that the contact feels clean and sturdy. You also are going to make a lot more power on your forehand when you have a stable contact. When you have a loose contact, you're going to lose power for sure. Now, of course, like I said before, if you hold the racket too tight, you are going to lose power as well, because you're going to lack range of motion. The wrist is going to be locked, and you're going to lack fundamental elements of the forehand, such as the wrist lag, if you indeed play with too tight of a hold on your racket. Now, in my experience, once we take care of the correct position of the hand on the racket, and once we have a stable contact, there's really no need to instruct the student to be loose unless there is a problem with stiffness. However, one of the most common tips is that players should just relax, and somehow the arm will take care of everything on its own. And that's a big myth. So that's a tip that's very often given. And now, when players are relaxed, often there's going to be a snapping at the moment of contact. There's going to be a lack of control, and balls are going to be spraying all over the place, because players are just too sloppy at the moment of contact and they have absolutely no stability. So naturally, the next tip is to apply topspin. And one of the most common tips when it comes to topspin is to just roll the wrist at the moment of contact around the ball like this. Supposedly the wrist is so important in the game of tennis. That's how the best players execute their forehands, by just snapping the wrist right at the moment of contact. So when you combine the looseness and the isolated movement of the wrist at the moment of contact, here's what happens. You end up with a spinny ball, but the ball has absolutely no penetration. You also start framing the ball, and generally there's a lack of control due to the lack of stability. And because you are going in a vertical fashion over the ball only with your wrist, and by the way, this is impossible with the wrist. There's always pronation of the forearm. If I was just to turn my wrist, if I hold my forearm tight, I can get to about right here. So it's always a pronation of the forearm that makes this windshield wiper motion. So that right there tells you that the wrist is not doing anything in isolation on the forehand. It's biomechanically impossible. It's the forearm pronation that's executing the windshield wiper motion. But even then, when the windshield wiper motion is executed in isolation, now we're left with a very thin stroke, and one that lacks penetration and depth. So naturally, the third tip then is to apply more power so that the student gets more depth. So here's a sequence of tips. Loose wrist, make topspin with the wrist, and hit harder. So when players start doing that, this is what it looks like. Honestly, I'm going to stop, because I'm actually letting go of the racket at the very end, because I feel like I'm going to do something to my wrist. This is the most dangerous sequence of tips in the game of tennis. closely followed by a similar sequence of tips on the serve, where supposedly players are snapping the serve with their wrist. This is complete nonsense and it's utterly dangerous. We can see in super slow-mo footage that it's the arm that's going up. Unless we're talking about very specific circumstances where maybe the player is going for an angle forehand, or they're executing a topspin lob, or they're just using the pace from the incoming ball, then yes, sometimes you do see more isolated movements. But generally on the forehand, what you see is the entire arm going up. So it's the entire body helping the arm go up, including the shoulder. And very shortly after contact, the pronation of the forearm sets in. So the entire body is involved, helping the racket go up. The body accommodates the swing path perfectly so that the wrist is safe. Now, professional tennis players don't think about that. Intuitively, they don't use the wrist. And if there were to use the wrist, you would see a lot more wrist injuries on tour. Now, let me share an anecdotal story of a student of mine who received this three-part sequence on the forehand. And what's so incredible about this story is that this student used to be a hand surgeon. According to him, this is one of the most complicated surgeries that you can perform. Somebody gets their fingers cut off and this surgeon puts them back together. Very complex, so he knows everything there is to know about the wrist. Now, his wife was an avid tennis player and he really wanted to start playing tennis. So he took a lesson and he received this three-part sequence of tips. They told him to relax the wrist, then they told him to roll the wrist, and then they told him to swing faster. Now what happened was that only after one lesson, he felt a sharp pain in his wrist and he had a wrist injury. Now, this happened on the hand that he does surgery with, and he had a difficult time doing surgery and had to take some time off. And after going online to get some info on forehand technique, he found one of my videos and reached out to me and told me this story. And since then, we've been training and he's been absolutely pain-free on the forehand after having taken 6 months off from tennis to let the wrist heal. And he's so happy that he can play tennis pain-free. And we had many discussions about the wrist in relation to the tennis strokes. And he told me that it is impossible that players are playing with the wrist because the wrist wouldn't be able to sustain that amount of power that's generated on the professional tour if the wrist was generating all that power. All the pressure of the stroke would be absorbed in the wrist joint that's, by the way, very fragile. And you would see pretty much every player get a wrist injury. Now, tennis players, of course, still get wrist injuries. There's no doubt about that, but they're not as common as some other injuries in the body. So the important takeaway from this lesson is that you shouldn't try to relax your wrist. Under no circumstance should you try to make topspin with your wrist. Under no circumstance should you try to snap your wrist on the serve. This is going to cause a lot of problems with your game, but most importantly, it can cause a very frustrating wrist injury that can keep you out of the game of tennis for a long time. Now, of course, the wrist is a very important part of the body when it comes to tennis strokes, whether we're talking about the serve, the backhand, or the forehand. Like I said, if you're holding the racket too tight, there's going to be a lack of mobility in the wrist and you're going to lack range of motion because of it. When it comes to the forehand, you do need to have range of motion in your wrist to achieve a lag. When it comes to the two-handed backhand, you need range of motion to achieve a racket drop. On the two-handed backhand, players that injure their left wrist, you often see that their two-handed backhands get a lot worse after they have surgery because they're lacking range of motion and their backhands are a lot worse. For example, the Potro or Mute didn't hit their backhands the same way after the surgery. On the one-handed backhand, the wrist also will change positions, but far less compared to the forehand and the two-handed backhand. And of course, in the serve, the wrist plays an important role, but it's somewhat passive when it comes to the pronation into the contact and the continuing pronation. Now, a lot of people take the Saber serve as an example of a wrist snap, and that's simply not true. What you're seeing there is a bending of the forearm. There's no wrist snapping, so to speak, on the Saber serve. What he does is bend the forearm and continue to pronate. So it kind of looks, when you see it in real time, that he's snapping at it, but he's actually not snapping with the wrist. So while the wrist has to be mobile, it has to be fluid in the strokes, under no circumstance should you try to consciously hit the ball with your wrist on any stroke, because you're going to be in a lot of trouble.